There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But there are also unknown knowns. The ancient and esoteric Order of the Jackalope is a secret society devoted to unearthing and sharing this forgotten knowledge. Each episode we take a story that has slipped out of some common knowledge and share it with you. No topic is off limits, except for the obvious. Greetings from Lodge 777. We've got an intriguing episode for you this week, Initiates, and I can't wait to get to it. But before we begin, I have to make a sincere apology to the good people of Ponpei, because I am going to absolutely butcher your beautiful language. Joking aside, if anyone out there wants to give me some pronunciation lessons, I'm all ears. Email me at jackalope@orderofthejackalope.com. Liminal Space, presented by Number 13. Micronesia is the northernmost region of Oceania, consisting of numerous scattered island groups north of New Guinea and east of the Philippines. The largest of these archipelagos is the Caroline Islands, which consist of some 500 islands scattered over 2,000 miles of open ocean. The largest island in the Carolines is Ponpei. This star-shaped high volcanic island bursts forth from the ocean and rises some 2,566 feet to the cloud-piercing peaks of New Guinea and Nan Madol, the Giant's Tooth, and the Big Mountain. Their slopes are blanketed by verdant rainforests that gradually give way to the dense, frequently impenetrable mangrove swamps that ring the island. Offshore, Ponpei is surrounded by a belt of smaller islands, sandbars, and reefs that make it almost unapproachable by sea, save for a few small gaps here and there, and a relatively safe harbor in the southeast. It's about as beautiful and idyllic a tropical paradise as you can imagine, but to James Francis O'Connell, it felt a lot like prison. O'Connell, an Irishman, had set to sea as a cabin boy on the Phoenix, but wound up stranded in Australia for several years when the ship was quarantined and condemned. In 1826, he signed on to the crew of the whaler John Bull, but on the way to Japan, the ship struck a coral reef and sunk. O'Connell, 5 other men, and 2 female missionaries wound up in a lifeboat. It drifted aimlessly on the ocean currents for days, and the 2 missionaries died. The next day, the other 6 survivors were shocked when their boat slammed into a coral reef on Pohnpei's northern shore. Almost at once, or so it seemed, hundreds of Pohnpeians emerged from the swamps and began furiously canoeing in their direction. Their behavior confused the castaways. At first, the natives tried to attack the lifeboat with spears, stones, and coconuts, only to eagerly surround it once it made landfall. What they didn't understand was that it was all an elaborate ceremony, both a show to frighten off invaders, but also to welcome visitors. You see, Pohnpeians believed that everything that washed up on their shores was a gift from the gods to be shared by all. That included the John Bull's lifeboat, its emergency supplies, and the 6 castaways. The men were stripped naked and split up among the tribes who had gathered to repel them. Most of the castaways were terrified, afraid that they were about to be a cannibal's feast, but O'Connell remained chipper and charmed his captors by dancing a hornpipe. He later impressed them with his courage by silently submitting to the complex and painful tattooing that marked him as a slave. He wound up with extensive tattoos on his arms, legs, belly, and back. His charm and toughness inspired his new owner to give him a place of honor in the tribe. At least, that's how O'Connell saw it, but it seems more like the chief saw him as a mascot, a court jester, or good luck charm. Basically, he was a dancing monkey. Even so, he was given a good deal of latitude for a slave. They returned some of his personal property, including a shaving mirror and 2 volumes of Miss Jane Porter's The Scottish Chiefs. He married Luelen, a chief's daughter, and had 2 children. He even had the freedom to roam the island and explore its secrets. As the years went on and the island became a port of call for whalers, he served as a sort of harbor pilot. He wasn't above a bit of rebellion from now and then, mind you. When he and his fellow captives found out that the Pohnpeians considered eels to be sacred and untouchable, they secretly caught as many as they could and had a massive eel fry on the shore. When the bones and skins were discovered, the tribe went ape nuts for days. On November 17, 1833, O'Connell was one of a group of Pohnpeians who rode out to greet the American whaler Spy out of Salem, Massachusetts. While O'Connell tried to pitch his services as a pilot to the captain, the islanders treated the Spy like any other gift from the sea and tried stripping it of everything that wasn't tied down. The ship's captain, John B. Knight, tried to keep the situation under control, but soon shots were fired, the natives retreated, and the Spy was headed back out to sea with O'Connell still aboard. Over the next several months, Captain Knight made several attempts to get rid of his unwelcome stowaway, but none of the nearby Spanish territories would take him. O'Connell returned the captain's lack of hospitality by trying to incite a mutiny, and was eventually clapped in irons to ensure his good behavior. He remained in the Spy's brig all during the long journey back to America, where he was unceremoniously booted overboard and left to fend for himself. O'Connell didn't have much trouble finding a job. Thanks to the explosion of the whaling industry, Americans were mad for anything from the South Seas. Pohnpei was of special interest because few Europeans had ever set foot on the island. I mean, they'd known about it for centuries. The Spanish first spotted Pohnpei in 1526, but they just sailed right past it. Subsequent explorers attempting to make landfall had been bewildered by the Pohnpeians' strange combination of hostile response and ceremonial welcome and sailed off to less confusing shores. Still, a few intrepid individuals had pressed on, including Pedro Fernandez de Quiros in 1595, Friedrich Benjamin Graf von Lütke in 1828, and C.H. Hart in 1836. They brought back tales of an island paradise full of beautiful birds and flowers, strange customs and superstitions, and mysterious ruins. Mysterious ruins? Oh yes. Off the shore of Temwen Island, southeast of the mainland, sit the mysterious and overgrown ruins of Nan Madol. It consists of almost 100 man-made islets built inside a lagoon, topped by basalt buildings ranging in size from small vaults to enormous fortresses, and connected to their neighbors by intricate canals. Explorers were very interested to learn more about Nan Madol, but most Pohnpeians refused to approach the complex or discuss it with outsiders. This led most European visitors to conclude that the Pohnpeians had no idea who had built Nan Madol or what it was used for. Therefore, it must have been built by some long-vanished race of white men. Probably Phoenicians. Those guys really got around. So by the time James Francis O'Connell came on the scene, Americans were dying to know more about Pohnpei and the mysterious site many were calling the Venice of the Pacific. O'Connell was all too happy to tell them about what he had seen, for a reasonable fee. He became the Tattooed Irishman, one of the country's most famous circus performers, dancing a terrible hornpipe, showing off his extensive tattoos, and telling wildly exaggerated tales of his time spent in Ponpei. In 1836, his best anecdotes were compiled into a book, A Residence of 11 Years in New Holland and the Caroline Islands. Perhaps the most spectacular part of his act involved recounting his visit to Nan Madol. He claimed to have been the first white man to have ever set foot there, and really played up the drama and danger.
But the most wonderful adventure made during the excursion, the relation of which will put my credit to a severer test than any other fact detailed, was the discovery of a large uninhabited island, upon which were stupendous ruins, of a character or of architecture differing altogether from the present style of the islanders, and of an extent truly astonishing. At a little distance the ruins appeared like some of the fantastic heapings of nature, but upon a nearer approach George and myself were astonished at the evident traces of the hand of man in their erection. At the entrance we passed for many yards between two walls, so near to each other that without changing the boat from side to side, we could have touched either of them with a paddle. They were about 10 feet high, in some places dilapidated, and in others in very good preservation. Over the tops of the wall, coconut trees and occasionally a breadfruit spread their branches, making a deep and refreshing shade. It was a deep solitude, not a living thing except for a few birds being discernible. Except the wall, there was no perceptible trace of the footsteps of man, no token that he had ever visited the spot. We examined the masonry and found the walls composed of stones, varying in size from 2 to 10 feet in length, and from 1 to 8 in breadth, carefully propped in the interstices and cracks with smaller fragments. They were built of the bluestone which abounds upon the inhabited islands, and is, as before stated, of a slatos formation, and were evidently split and adapted for the purpose to which they were applied. In many places the walls had so fallen that we climbed over them with ease. Nothing during my residence on the Carolines was productive of so much deep yet vague speculation. The immense size of a portion of the stones in the walls rendered it impossible that they could have been placed there without some mechanical contrivance superior to anything I have met among the natives, and no contemptible degree of architectural skill was manifested in their construction, though the dilapidated state afforded no clue to the purpose for which they were piled. The largest cluster of these ruins merits a particular description. The outside wall encloses a space about a mile in circumference. Its area is not, as in the other cases, empty, but at about 20 feet distance from the outside wall is another, exactly parallel to the first. Then at the same distance another, and still another, to a number of 5 or 6. The center wall encloses a space of only about 40 feet across, and is perfectly square. The outside wall was, upon one end of the edifice, about 25 to 30 feet in height. Upon the other 3 sides, which had been more exposed to the tide, the walls had become undermined, and fallen in many places, but the inner walls were all perfect. The standing side of the outer wall had evidently been the front, for square pillars, which had formed a part of some portico or similar structure, lay across the creek. The entrance or aperture in the wall was about 4 feet in height. Upon entering, no aperture in the next wall presented itself, but after working our way among the brush, we discovered an entrance at the corner of the wall to the right of the first. Passing this, we found an aperture in the next, and at the left, and thus finding doors alternately at the right and left, we penetrated to the inner wall. And walking inside of this, by the accidental falling of a piece of wood, we discovered a vault, into which I descended. My first supposition was that it was a burial place, but all that appeared to sustain such an opinion was one skeleton which lay at the bottom, its parts scattered to and fro about the ground. This distribution was probably done by the rats. I found no paddle or war club in the vault. This body was accounted for after my return to Newt, where I was informed that a chief of Kiti had been buried there. Upon the island of Kiti, the natives were unable or unwilling to give me any information. The logs and the sods which covered them, concealing the top of the vault, must have been placed when the body which I found was deposited there. The fact that the vault was used for a burial place, even in this isolated instance within the memory of the living natives, would seem to speak to some vague tradition of the purpose for which the place was built, but I could never get hold of any more satisfactory tradition than that the ruins were built by Animan.
Gripping, isn't it? Too bad it's all lies. James Francis O'Connell had never been in a shipwreck. James Francis O'Connell wasn't even his real name. He kept his true identity under wraps, probably because he was an escaped convict from Australia. He had been on Ponpei, that much was true. He had been adopted into a chief's family and married his daughter. But his father-in-law was hardly the big shot O'Connell made him out to be. He had been ritually tattooed, though he later supplemented those with fresh ink to make his look more dramatic. His knowledge of the Pohnpeian language was minimal, and his descriptions of Pohnpeian society and culture baffling. He talked about warriors using bows and arrows, which the Pohnpeians did not have. He seemed to think that the society had a race-based caste system, with the light-skinned moonjobs ruling over the dark-skinned, N-words, which is not true at all, but seemed to play well with his American audiences. His descriptions of Nan Madol are way off. The buildings are square, not circular. The stones are not worked, but naturally occurring basalt columns carefully stacked like Lincoln logs. His descriptions of individual buildings are way off, and the sizes he gives are usually an order of magnitude greater than reality. Ponpei was also not as isolated or as untouched by white men as he made it out to be. For starters, there were his 5 fellow castaways. Beyond that, the island was a center of the local tortoiseshell trade, repeatedly visited by European traders and lousy with rootless beachcombers. O'Connell wasn't too concerned about the inaccuracies. The inaccuracies were his bread and butter. Gate receipts and book sales made him a pretty penny. He would have probably been less sanguine if he knew showbiz would be the death of him. In January 1854, the circus he was performing in installed a newfangled electric arc lamp to illuminate the big top. O'Connell got a lungful of the toxic fumes it was putting out, and died. As for Ponpei, throughout the 1830s, the whaling boom brought more and more vessels to the island, bringing with them alcohol, tobacco, prostitution, syphilis, and smallpox. Once the island's reputation for lawless hedonism was established, well, then the missionaries started showing up. In the 1870s, Germany tried to take over the island on the grounds that while it was nominally Spanish, they clearly weren't using it, which led to Spain finally colonizing the island in 1886. The Pohnpeians weren't exactly keen on being anyone's colony, and made occasional attempts at resistance, which were usually shut down with naval bombardments. Eventually, the cash-strapped Spaniards wound up selling the island to the Germans after the Spanish-American War, but the Teutonic triumph was short-lived, and the Japanese took over after World War I. The United States bombed the hell out of the island during World War II, and then administered it as a trust territory until 1986, when the Federated States of Micronesia were formed. Throughout this century of chaos, Europeans remained fascinated by Nan Madol and the other ruins on Ponpei. Alas, the island's remoteness and the reluctance of the natives to speak meant that they had to rely on travelogues. For the longest time, that meant exactly one book, A Residence of 11 Years in New Holland and the Caroline Islands by James Francis O'Connell. As a result, wild speculation was the order of the day. Some thought the vaults of Nan Madol had been built by evil black dwarves called the Cholokai. Theosophists attributed its construction to Lemurians who survived the sinking of their doomed continent. And well, not saying it's aliens, but stories claim that the tombs of Nan Madol contain the bones of literal giants. Treasure hunters believe they concealed hidden treasures, buckets of pearls, and coffins made of precious metal. After World War II, it was rumored that the Japanese had been extracting enough solid platinum from the ruins to fund the entire war effort. In the Moon Pool, pulp author Abraham Merritt placed a hidden tunnel in one of the eel ponds of Nan Madol, which led to a sinister underground civilization that could control monsters from beyond space and time. Speaking of monsters from beyond space and time, H.P. Lovecraft even made an oblique reference to Nan Madol in The Shadow over Innsmouth. As amazing as these utterly baseless speculations are, what happened in Ponpei in the early 1900s is even more amazing, which is that Western archaeologists and ethnologists, rather than just latching on to some cockamamie idea of their own and promoting it as the gospel truth, actually started to earn the trust of the Pohnpeians and asked them what they knew. The islanders, who had been dismissed for centuries as children and savages completely ignorant of their island's history, turned out to know quite a bit. In fact, they knew the whole dang story. Let's take a quick jaunt back to Ceylon Isle, the other side of yesterday.
Long ago, 7 men and 9 women from Pohnpei, the lands that lie over the horizon to the west, set out to search for a new home. During their journey, they met the octopus spirit, Lida Kika, who suggested a suitable spot nearby where they could settle. When they arrived, they realized they'd been tricked. The island was tiny, barely bigger than a single canoe. These bold voyagers weren't going to let some mischievous octopus get the better of them. You see, Pohnpei is not just some legendary land of the west. The lands beyond the horizon are also the spirit world, and its residents command mighty magics. The 16 travelers used that magic to call the rest of the island above the surface. When ocean waves started to break the stones, they raised a reef around the island to break the waves, and then planted mangrove swamps around the coast to protect the interior. Once the island was secure, they built a large stone altar and piled rocks on top of it, and called forth animals and plants to populate the land. They named the island Ponpei, or upon a stone altar.
Archaeological excavations at Nan Madol have uncovered potsherds and other artifacts that date back to approximately 50 BC, though the island was likely inhabited for centuries before that. The style of pottery suggests that these initial migrants were from more settled lands to the west, possibly Yap or Palau.
This was the start of the Mwehi Keu, the building time. Throughout this legendary age, 5 more voyages would arrive from Katau, each bringing a new group of sorcerers armed with the secret knowledge of how to raise mountains, shape the island, build houses, and forge a new civilization.
Sometime during the Mwehi Keu, the construction of Nan Madol began, probably about 500 AD. The complex is located in a relatively unique geographical feature, a protected and shallow lagoon on the island of Temwen off the southeastern coast of Ponpei. Inside the lagoon, the locals began to construct artificial islets. Each of the islets is built on a foundation made of basalt boulders, some of them weighing as much as 50 tons. Initially these came from nearby, but as the supply of suitable boulders grew scarce, they were eventually sourced from locations all over Ponpei. They would be slowly transported along the coast via raft before arriving at Nan Madol to be dumped into the lagoon. Once the boulder foundations were complete, temporary wooden thatch structures would be built on top of them to help shape the island and support the next stages of construction. The next step was to enclose the foundations with walls made from basalt. These too may have originally been local, but were eventually quarried far away in the region of Soke, on the northwestern corner of the main island. The Pohnpeians would build massive fires to heat up the basalt cliff there and suddenly cool it with water. The sudden expansion and cooling would create fractures in the rock, and, this is the neat part, basalt naturally fractures into prismatic columns. Once these columns had been transported to the lagoon, they could be stacked around the boulder foundations to create a rectangular base. Eventually, the outer wall of the islet would rise as far as 6 feet above the surface of the sea. Gaps between the boulders and columns would then be filled in with coral, pebble, sand, and other rubble. The result was a sturdy artificial islet on top of which other structures could be built. If 2 islets were adjacent, they would be separated by finished canals lined along the bottom with more basalt columns. These canals gave rise to the name Nan Madol within the spaces. Later European visitors were often put in mind of a more familiar locale back home and nicknamed it the Venice of the Pacific. Okay, so once you have a bunch of artificial islets, what do you do with them? The same thing you do with any reclaimed land. You build on them. Some of the islets supported small thatched-roofed huts, likely the residences of Saworo, priests, who communicated with powerful nature spirits and long-departed ancestors. Other islets had altars and structures used in specific rites and rituals. Sacred pools on Pei Kapwa may have been used to hold animals to be sacrificed. There was a mighty feast hall on Kondarak, where feasts were held to honor the dead. Women would rub their bellies on Pawnee to ensure an easy birth. Further out on the reef was Nan Moluse, a large boulder which youths would leap from to prove their courage. Still, it's hard to say exactly how Nan Madol was used in its earliest days, because its nature changed drastically over the following centuries.
The 7th voyage to arrive from Pohnpei was different. This one brought the mightiest sorcerers yet, the brothers Olosipa and Olosopa, who had come to build a mighty temple and fortress. At first they tried to build in Soke in the northwest, but the ocean waves troubled them and the locals rebuffed them. Then they tried to build in Net in the north, only to run into the same problems. They slowly worked their way clockwise around the island, unable to find a suitable location. Eventually, they reached the island of Temwen. They used powerful magic to create a protected lagoon, and then to fly boulders and basalt prisms from the mainland to Temwen. These were then stacked in the lagoon to create islands and buildings. This was the creation of Nan Madol. Once the fortress was complete, the 2 brothers turned their powers against the island that had rejected them, conquering large parts of it and cowing the rest into submission. Olosipa died in the process, but Olosopa carried on. When his conquest was complete, Olosopa renamed the land he governed from his fortress Delur and assumed the lofty title of Sawdelur, or the Master of Delur.
This was the start of the Mwehi Keriau, the era of the Sawdelurs. The Sawdelurs were members of the Dipwilap, or Great Clan, which came from the sea and settled in the northwest of Ponpei near Soke. They eventually subjugated the other clans on the island and seized total control sometime between 1000 and 1200 AD. Once their conquest was complete, the Sawdelurs separated themselves from their subjects to create an aura of mystery and power. One of the ways they did this was by moving their court to Nan Madol. The temple complex had previously been the realm of the sacred, home only to priests, spirits, and the dead. By claiming it as their own, the Sawdelurs signaled that they were more than mere men, they were gods made flesh. It worked. For centuries they were feared, not only as mighty warriors, but as powerful sorcerers who could see and hear everything that happened on the island. The existing structures in the lagoon were not enough to support the Sawdelur and his court, so the complex had to be aggressively expanded. New islets were formed, and the center of the complex moved away from the mainland of Madol Pao, Upper Madol, to the outer edge of the lagoon, Madol Pa, Lower Madol. Eventually the complex would grow to include 92 artificial islets and enclose the entire lagoon. Some of the new islets now house permanent residences for the Sawdelur and his court. The size of these houses indicated the importance of their residence, with lesser functionaries forced to live in cramped quarters only 40 square feet in size, while high muckety-mucks would stretch out in relatively palatial chambers of up to 450 square feet. The Sawdelur and his family lived in the veritable palace of Pan Kadira, which also doubled as a temple to the crocodile spirit Nan Mwahu. Visitors and servants had to enter through a low opening that forced them to crawl, reminding them of their position relative to the Sawdelur. The entrance to Nan Madol from the sea was guarded by the imposing fortress of Nan Doas, with multiple rows of basalt walls that tower 30 feet above the waves and which still impress even today. On Pei Kapwa, the Sawdelurs reportedly used a magic pool to spy on their subjects through the power of Unmatakai, the watchman of the land. Other islets served more prosaic purposes, like the one where signal drums were housed, or the one where coconut oil was pressed. To finish enclosing the lagoon and protecting Nan Madol, the Sawdelurs began building tombs. Lots and lots of tombs. Tombs for the Sawdelurs, tombs for Saworo, tombs for chiefs. Tombs eventually became so plentiful that they began to pop up on islets previously reserved for other purposes. Of course, all of these new islets and buildings were made from basalt columns sourced from faraway Soke. Quarrying the columns, transporting them from the farthest side of the island, and carefully piling them into islets and buildings required a massive workforce which may have numbered almost 1,000. Conscripting these laborers was a great way for the Sawdelurs to flex their might and test the loyalty of their subjects. The ritual use of Nan Madol continued unabated, though the rituals themselves also began to change to reflect Sawdelur rule. Here's a perfect example. On a shallow saltwater pool on the island of Edad lived the great eel, Nan Sawal, an avatar of Nani Son Sapwa, the honored spirit of the land. Once a year a sea turtle would be captured, deshelled, and offered up to Nan Sawal in the ritual of Pwangan Sapwa. If the eel ate the sacrifice, it signaled that Nani Son Sapwa was pleased with the Sawdelurs and their rule. The ritual was fraught with meaning both sacred and political. Though the Pohnpeians revered Ilake, the eel goddess, she and her children were freshwater eels. Nan Sawal was a saltwater eel, not truly of the island but from beyond the sea, much like the Sawdelurs themselves. The turtle was a symbol of life after death, and its sacrifice to a symbol of the Sawdelurs symbolized their control over the island's spiritual life. The turtle was also a symbol of the island itself. In Ponpeian, Wehi can mean both turtle and state. In short, the Pongan Sapwa was a sacrifice of both soul and land to a ruling clan made of outsiders. Outsiders who were about to get their just desserts.
Over time, the Sawdelurs became cruel and capricious. Katie Paralong feasted while his subjects starved, and committed suicide after he was tricked into eating human flesh as an ironic punishment. His successor, Ripen Wenlake, leaned into the whole cannibal thing, gleefully devouring his plumpest and most delicious subjects. Sekon Mwehi took so much from his subjects that he demanded even all of the lice in their hair. Others forced legendary heroes to perform impossible tasks for their amusement, and made human sacrifices of their subjects in revenge for the smallest slights. In their hubris, though, these men who thought themselves gods decided to mess with actual gods. They attacked the cult of Luknan Sapwe, the god above the land, who had foretold of their downfall. Nansapwe himself was taken prisoner, and staked out in front of Pohnpei so the Soddlers could watch him slowly die. The other gods of Ponpei took pity on the dying god and sent a Sawi, or grouper, to rescue him and carry him away to Piadak, the lands beyond the horizon to the east. There Nan met an elderly kinswoman and gave her a magic fruit that would enable her to bear his child. Years later, when this demigod had become a man, he returned to liberate the land of his father, accompanied by 333 stout warriors. His fleet landed near the fortress of Nandoas and ritually prepared for the battles to come. The Soddler, seeking to turn a potential enemy into an ally, welcomed the invaders as guests and gave them gifts of food and an offer to settle where they pleased. He even bestowed noble honors on their leader, giving him the title of Isokelekel, the Prince of Fortifications. This only made the Pohnpeians grumble, since now they had to give up their own lands and food to support foreign invaders. Seeing how weak the Soddlers had become and how badly the Pohnpeians wanted to be free of them, the invaders dropped any pretense of friendliness and open warfare broke out. The two sides met at Pei. The fight changes. At first, the Soddlers' warriors had the upper hand, driving the invaders back to the sea after several days of battle. Then, one of Isokelekel's bravest men signaled his intention to fight to the last by spearing his own foot to the ground. This rallied the invaders, who fought back and destroyed the Soddlers' army. In a final confrontation at the waterfall of Kamau Pungwapung, the last Soddler was defeated. Rather than suffer death at the hands of the invaders, he leapt over the falls and was transformed into a fish. The land now belonged to Isokelekel. The Mwehi Kesela had begun.
During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Pohnpeians began breaking away from the central government of the Soddlers. One telling development is that late in the Mwehi Keriau, small basalt vaults began appearing in other parts of the island. Locals were no longer sending their honored dead to Nan Madol to be buried, but entombing them closer to home. Remote regions in the north and northwest became de facto independent, pledging only nominal fealty to the Soddlers. Eventually, the supremacy of the Soddlers was more religious and symbolic than political. It's not clear exactly when Isokelekel came on the scene, but it appears to be sometime in the late 16th or early 17th century. That means these momentous developments were happening at the same time that Europeans first noticed Ponpei and chose to ignore it. As mentioned before, the name Isokelekel is actually a title, which may imply that he was a native Pohnpeian, a subordinate of the Soddlers who rebelled. Or it could be that he was a foreign invader, albeit one who could trace his heritage back to the island. If that's the case, it's worth noting that Piadak is traditionally associated with the nearby island of Kozrai, which has its own monumental basalt structures and tombs. The stone city of Lila dates from sometime in the 14th and 15th century, right in the middle of Ponpei's Mwehi Keriau. It's possible it was started by Ponpeian exiles. However, Nan Madol and Lilu are only superficially similar, and local traditions assign them local origins. They may instead represent independent developments of traditions inherited from earlier Micronesian cultures, like the Lapita culture. Whatever his true origins may have been, the story of Isokelekel shows an adept juggling of myth and political symbolism that rivals that of the Soddlers. The Sawi which rescued Nan was not just a messenger of the gods, but was also a sacred animal for several of the island's major tribes, a symbol of their own rebellion and resistance. His avenging son returned not from Piadak, where the Soddlers had come from, but Piadak, the opposite half of the spirit world. Even claiming descent from Nan was a political masterstroke. It made Isokelekel a child of the island returned home, and not a foreign invader like the Soddlers. After overthrowing the Soddlers, Isokelekel made it clear that it was to be business as usual, at least at the top levels of society. He moved into Pohnpei and kept Nan Madol as the capital. Small incidents proved he could be just as capricious and cruel as his predecessors. He even married his sister, though since he was half god, it was all okay. Early in his reign, there was some new construction in Nan Madol. On the islet of Palakapwa, he raised a new feasting hall, Kupaleng, where chiefs and commoners ate together. For the most part, though, construction of new islets and buildings ceased. Isokelekel's big accomplishment was a massive reorganization of the tribal structure of the island. He divided Ponpei into 5 wehi: Madolenhimwa, Kiri, Soke, and Net. These distinctions had existed before Isokelekel's time, but he was the one who codified them. Madolenhimwa, which included Temwen and Nan Madol, was the most powerful and important. Soke, the former power center of the Soddlers, was next, and Net, which had virtually nothing going for it, the least. Governance of each wehi was split between 2 clans, a senior clan led by a Nanwarki who was in charge, and a junior clan led by a Nanken who executed the Nanwarki's law. Each clan and region had its own line of elaborate titles and offices, and a complicated line of succession. To put some of this in a practical context, the chief who adopted James Francis O'Connell was the Undal on Net, the guardian of Net, who was far down the line of succession of the junior clan and the least powerful of the five Wehi. As important as this reorganization was, Isokelakel himself proved to be a mere blip in Pohnpei's long and storied history. After he was dead and buried beneath the altar of the life-giving turtle, the Wehis turned their back on his successors and started operating independently. The Nan Morkis of Madol Himwa continued to insist on their paramount importance, and the other Wehi played along since Madol Himwa controlled Nan Madol, and they needed access to it for their rituals. European visitors during Wehi Kapehu, the modern era, thought Nan Madol was abandoned. It certainly looked the part. Many of the monumental structures had been abandoned to the elements. Wooden timbers rotted away, thatched roofs collapsed, trees and vines took root in the courtyards of palaces and temples. Mangroves spread throughout the reef, their roots breaking down even the mighty walls of Nandoas. Even walls that had withstood the assault of countless invaders could not stand against the encroachment of nature. The site may have been neglected, but it was hardly abandoned. Ritual worship at Nan Madol continued in spite of the work of Christian missionaries and the twin scourges of smallpox and measles that devastated the island and reduced the population from 20,000 to about 5,000. In the 1850s, missionaries described one of the many rituals held there, a yearly rite of renewal called the Puang Lapalap, or Great Night, which lasted an astounding 17 days. No, what ultimately brought an end to Nan Madol was this. During the Puang Lapalap in 1855, one of the Sawara felt that his comrades did not give him a fair share of the turtle that had been sacrificed. He returned to Nan Madol, went to a pool on one of the sacred sanctuaries, and feasted on all the eels he could catch. This petty act of revenge somehow did what all the Sawdlers' cannibalism, incest, dark sorcery, and attempted deicide could not do. It defiled the entire complex and made it unfit for ritual activity. Nan Madol remained a curiosity for sailors and scholars for years, though its remoteness made it difficult to study. It wasn't until the late 1960s that the Smithsonian Institution and other groups began the first modern archaeological investigations into Nan Madol. Nan Madol was placed in the U.S. National Register of Historic Places in 1974 and was made a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2006. Even these moves were not uncontroversial, since the Nan Morki of Madol Himwa still insisted his clan owned the site and objected to preservation efforts that chipped away at their sovereignty. Today, the former temple and fortress is now a popular tourist destination. It remains as fascinating and frightening to modern eyes as it first appeared to Europeans almost 400 years ago. Key sources for this episode include David Hanlon's Upon a Stone Altar, A History of the Island of Ponpei to 1890, Bill Ballenger's The Lost City of Stone, The Book of Luelen by Luelen Bernart, and the critical edition of James Francis O'Connell's A Residence of 11 Years in New Holland and the Caroline Islands, published by the Australian National University Press in 1972. Connections! We've touched down in Micronesia before. In Series 2's Cold Hard Cash, we made a visit to the island of Yap, where we discussed its curious stone money and the white men who almost ruined it for everyone. That's all for now, initiates. Our next transmission will be in 2 weeks, and is a little episode we're calling The War Between the States. No, it's not the war you're thinking of, but you'll have to tune in to learn more. Until then, quicquid minime sciant, optime scire. Liminal Space was written and produced by David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope and is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 international license. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. The script for this episode, with sources, links, and more, can be found on our website, orderthejackalope.com. That's orderthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. Do you have opinions about this episode? Why not share them over on our Discord server, link in the show notes. Or tag us on social media. We can be found at Order Jackalope on Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, and Tumblr. If neither of those options works for you, you can always send us an old-fashioned email at jackalope@orderthejackalope.com. We're recruiting new lodge members. We'll initiate anyone into the secret mysteries. All they have to do is share a secret mystery of their own. Visit our website and click Join Us for more information.